Okay, let's dive into a topic that, well, it touches pretty much everyone's life, often stirring up confusion and stress. Boundaries. It's definitely one of those words we hear constantly.
Absolutely. You need better boundaries or they have no boundaries, but actually doing it, setting and maintaining them, that feels incredibly challenging for so many of us.
It really does. And I think for a long time, many people feel like struggling with boundaries is some kind of personal failing, like they're
Mhm.
just not, strong enough or
Yeah,
something.
right.
But the sources we're looking at for this deep dive offer a much more, well, empowering perspective.
Yeah, they really do. It's not a flaw. It's presented as a skill you probably just weren't taught.
Exactly.
And that's the core insight we're unpacking today. We're drawing from psychotherapist and relationship expert Terri Cole's work, specifically excerpts from her books Boundary Boss and the Boundary Boss Workbook.
So our mission here is really to cut through the noise,
Mm.
to explore these sources, pull out the most important insights, and understand what healthy boundaries actually look like.
And why they feel so difficult sometimes.
Yeah. And practically how to start building them. It's about getting you, the listener, quickly and thoroughly informed on how to finally navigate this stuff with hopefully more clarity and confidence. So let's start where the sources do. What are boundaries, really?
Well, Cole defines boundaries in two key ways. First, there are your outer boundaries.
Okay.
These are about telling others how you will interact with them. What's okay with you, what's not okay in your relationships.
Right, that's the part most people think of setting limits with other people.
Exactly. But just as important, maybe even more so, are your inner
Inner
boundaries.
boundaries. Tell me more.
This is about how you interact with yourself, your internal discipline, your self-talk, how you manage your own time, your energy.
Okay. That distinction is huge. So it's not just about protecting yourself from the outside world,
No, 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 no.
but also about building a healthier relationship with yourself.
Precisely. And the sources are very clear on this. Fuzzy or, non-existent boundaries, they complicate absolutely everything.
Yeah.
They're often the root cause of so much draining drama in our lives. And what's often missed, I think, is that we might be the ones unintentionally creating these fires.
The ones we're always trying to put out.
Right. Simply because we lack the skills to prevent them in the first place.
That makes a lot of sense. It's easy to blame others, but maybe you're like enabling the situation without realizing it.
Mm-hmm.
The sources also bring up a term Terri Cole uses, high functional codependency, or HFC. What's that about?
It's a really powerful concept, actually, because many people don't see themselves fitting the stereotypical image of codependency. They might be successful, seem independent.
Right, they're functioning highly in the world.
Exactly. But HFC, as Cole defines it, is about feeling overly responsible, like excessively responsible for the feelings, the experiences, maybe the actions of certain key people in your life.
Okay. And how does that high-functioning version typically show up? What does it look like?
Well, it often manifests as overgiving, constantly doing too much, or what she calls overfunctioning, basically taking on way more than your share in relationships or situations. And a really common one is automatically jumping in to offer unsolicited advice, trying to fix other people's problems.
The classic "who asked you" scenario. We've all seen that or done it.
Exactly. It often comes from a good place, but it's an attempt to control outcomes, really. And the focus is always outward on other people's lives.
Which means?
Which inevitably means your own needs, your desires, your boundaries, they just fall by the wayside.
So if these poor boundaries create all this complexity, where do they even come from? The sources really trace this back, don't they?
They do. They point right back to our earliest influences, our childhood experiences, sometimes referred to as original injuries.
Because that's where our initial blueprint for relationships gets formed, right?
Yes, exactly. Think about childhood environments. Maybe there was abuse or neglect or really strict rules, maybe no privacy, or that feeling of enmeshment.
Enmeshment. Like where families are too close, no separation.
Yeah, where there's very little separation between individuals, their feelings, their problems. All these experiences deeply shape our automatic way of interacting with the world and other people.
And the sources connect this to Carl Rogers' idea of conditions of worth.
Right.
Yeah.
As kids, we learn pretty quickly what we need to do or be to feel worthy of love, or maybe just to avoid criticism from our caregivers. And we internalize these rules. If love felt conditional, like you're good when you're quiet or you're loved when you get good grades, that becomes part of our unconscious programming. It shapes our sense of self-worth and, crucially, our comfort level with actually asserting our own needs later on.
Wow. The sources also bring in some really critical historical context here too, particularly around women.
Yes, this is a vital piece, I think. Cole highlights how, for centuries, millennia even, women were treated essentially as property, excluded from power, their voices silenced, long before even basic rights like voting.
A really long history.
A very long history. And she cites work suggesting this has had a profound internalized impact, contributing to, unconscious belief in negative stereotypes about women, fostering internalized depression, inferiority complexes, maybe even self-hate.
And that stuff doesn't just vanish overnight because laws change. Those deeply rooted gender roles and societal biases, they stick around.
Precisely. So these unresolved past pains, these earlier injuries, they don't just stay neatly tucked away in the past. The sources describe them acting like an emotional time machine.
Emotional time machine. How so?
Well, a trigger in the present, something someone says or does, can instantly transport you back to the feelings of that original injury. And that feeling drives your current behavior, often completely unconsciously.
Like reacting really submissively to a demanding boss because they unconsciously remind you of an authoritarian parent from way back.
Exactly that kind of thing. Or the example given in the source about a film producer who keeps rejecting this talented actress because unconsciously she reminds him of an ex he had a bad experience with. These old wounds, they really do affect our decision-making, our communication, and fundamentally our ability to set clear boundaries in the here and now.
Okay, so we get why it's hard and where it often comes from.
Yeah.
How do these poor boundary patterns actually show up in day-to-day life? The sources list several really common ones. Let's maybe unpack a few of those.
Yeah, definitely. One of the most prevalent, according to Cole, is the insta-yes.
The automatic yes,
Right.
just blurting it out before you've even processed the request.
Yes, exactly. It's saying yes purely out of habit or deep conditioning. The sources point out it's often really driven by fear underneath.
Fear. Fear of what?
Fear of disappointing someone, fear of conflict, fear of what might happen if you actually say no. It's a reaction, not a mindful choice.
That sounds exhausting. Which kind of ties into another pattern they mentioned, overfunctioning.
Absolutely. Overfunctioning is consistently doing more than is really your responsibility. It totally blurs the lines between your job or your role in a relationship and what's actually appropriate for other people to handle themselves.
Right.
And this leads straight to burnout, feeling really underappreciated, and often a lot of resentment bubbling under the surface. The sources suggest this dynamic where one person overfunctions and maybe another person underfunctions is often something we learn in our families growing up. It becomes the norm.
It's a cycle you get stuck in.
Yeah.
And speaking of cycles, the auto-advice giving, or that who asked you thing we touched on earlier.
Yeah, this is feeling compelled, almost driven, to jump in and fix or advise or solve other people's problems, even when they haven't actually asked for your help.
Right. They might just want to vent.
Exactly. The sources label this unhealthy helping, and it actually limits true intimacy because you're not just listening and being present. You're trying to manage or control their situation. A key insight here from the sources is to stop focusing so much on why they keep coming to you with their problems, and instead focus on your boundary around how you choose to respond.
Focus on your side of the street. Manage your reaction. Got it. Another tricky one mentioned is making assumptions.
Oh yeah. This means assuming others just know how you feel, or assuming they share your values, or, assuming they'll remember important dates or details without you actually checking in.
Or reminding them.
Right. And it also includes the stories we tell ourselves to excuse other people's maybe not so great behavior, or just to avoid conflict. Oh, they didn't really mean it, or they must just be having a really bad day.
We create these narratives in our heads to avoid dealing with the reality of the situation.
Exactly. And then the sources highlight the classic victim and martyr syndromes.
How do those play out with boundaries?
Well, someone operating from victim syndrome tends to feel helpless. They often believe their wants don't really matter or that their actions don't have any real impact anyway.
Feeling powerless.
Yeah. And martyrdom is its close cousin. You still feel powerless, but you're kind of keeping score. You're overgiving, doing everything for everyone, but then silently resenting them, feeling like they owe you something because of all your sacrifices.
Keeping that secret tally sheet. Oof. What about shadow addictions? That sounds intriguing.
These are behaviors that are often socially acceptable, maybe even praised sometimes, like working excessively, compulsive exercising, maybe even excessive shopping or drinking.
Things that don't look like typical addictions on the surface.
Exactly. But they're being used, often unconsciously, to numb or avoid emotional pain. They might seem productive, but the source points out they actually block emotional growth. And eventually they cause pain upstream in your life, maybe health issues, relationship conflict, just total energy depletion.
They offer temporary escape, maybe a secondary gain, which kind of removes the urgency to actually change the underlying issue.
Precisely. And finally, the sources really stress the importance of becoming aware of any personal bitterness, just noticing it.
Bitterness.
Yeah, holding on to unresolved feelings from past hurts or conflicts. It can keep us really stuck in negative patterns and make setting boundaries now feel even harder, almost impossible sometimes. The example they give of the woman who's constantly triggered by controlling women because of unresolved stuff with her sister really illustrates this point powerfully.
Okay, so recognizing these patterns, their
Mhm.
origins, that's a huge first step. But the big question is, how do you actually move towards becoming, as the book calls it, a boundary boss?
Well, the sources are really clear. It's a gradual process. It happens step by step, not overnight.
And there's a specific phase mentioned, the in-between. What's that?
Yes, this is described as a really critical stage. It's after you've gained awareness, you know the old ways aren't working, but before the new skills feel natural or automatic.
Oh,
The old methods didn't work, maybe they were even harmful, but you haven't fully mastered the new ways of responding yet. It can feel really vulnerable, kind of like you've put down your old weapons, even if they were ineffective.
It's that awkward learning curve phase where you might mess up, feel exposed, maybe even regress sometimes.
Exactly. And that's why patience and radical self-compassion are presented as absolutely essential during this time. It's completely normal to feel fear or anxiety, maybe even guilt, when you start changing those deeply ingrained boundary patterns.
Right.
The key is to notice the feelings, maybe sit with them for a bit without judging, and really celebrate the small wins, those tiny shifts you manage to make.
And the sources also emphasize that sometimes you kind of need to feel the pain of not having boundaries before the incentive to change really becomes strong enough.
Yes, that's a key point.
Yeah.
If the secondary gain, whatever benefit you're getting from staying in that familiar discomfort, maybe avoiding conflict, outweighs the perceived pain or fear of changing, you'll likely stay stuck. Pain can actually be a powerful catalyst for growth here.
Okay, let's get really practical then. What are the actual tools and strategies the sources provide for building these boundary skills? Where do we start?
It really starts with deep self-knowledge. Identifying your personal okay, not okay list.
Okay, not okay.
Yeah. What are your preferences? The things that are just nice to have. What are your needs? Those somewhere in between things that genuinely impact your well-being. And crucially, what are your deal breakers? The absolute non-negotiable items for you. These are what inform where you need to set boundaries.
And that links back to the inner boundaries we talked about earlier, right?
Crucially, the sources stress over and over that your outer boundaries are almost always a direct reflection of your inner boundaries, basically, how you treat yourself.
Right. And self-care is highlighted as absolutely foundational.
Oh, essential. The sources identify a lack of consistent self-care as a common hallmark of disordered boundaries and codependency. And it's framed not as selfish, but as fundamental fuel for life.
Not a luxury, but a necessity.
Exactly. Good sleep, some form of movement or exercise, maybe mindfulness, these are presented as non-negotiables for becoming a boundary boss. Even small, consistent daily acts of self-care improve your overall energy, your resilience, and perhaps most importantly, prioritizing yourself actually teaches others that you are someone who deserves to be prioritized. It sets the standard.
You set that internal standard first. Mindfulness and self-soothing are also mentioned as key practices.
Yes. Practices like deep breathing or even just a minute of simple meditation, they add those critical 2 to 3 seconds of delayed response time into interactions.
That tiny gap.
That tiny gap makes all the difference. Instead of reacting automatically from an old trigger, you create space to choose your response consciously. And the sources also recommend creating a self-soothing toolkit.
A toolkit, like what?
Yeah, like gathering specific items that engage your senses, maybe something soft to touch, a calming scent, a piece of music, a favorite tea, things you can turn to help manage the difficult emotions that inevitably come up when you're changing these deep patterns.
So you're not just managing the external interaction, you're actively managing your internal state too.
Exactly, that's key. Another powerful tool mentioned is visualization.
Picturing things.
Yeah, taking just a few minutes each morning to visualize desired outcomes. Maybe picturing yourself confidently having a boundary conversation that you're nervous about. It sounds simple, but it can prime your brain and positively influence your ability to actually use these new skills throughout the day. It's about tapping into the power of intention.
And positive affirmations, do they fit in?
Yes, definitely. Using positive self-statements, things you want to believe about yourself, even if you don't fully believe them yet, like, I am worthy of respect, or it is easy for me to communicate my needs calmly. Repeating these helps strengthen self-esteem and consciously redirect your unconscious thoughts away from those old fears and towards what you're trying to build.
Okay, so moving from that internal work to external action communication seems like a huge piece of this puzzle.
It really is the practical application, isn't it? And effective communication is definitely presented as a learned skill, not something most of us are born knowing how to do well.
Right.
The sources encourage identifying your default style first. Are you typically direct or indirect, passive or aggressive, maybe antagonistic or more congenial, cryptic or accurate, dishonest or honest? Knowing your starting point helps you see what areas need work.
And the absolute cornerstone technique seems to be using I statements. Everyone talks about those.
It's fundamental, yeah. Because it shifts the focus away from blaming the other person, which usually just makes them defensive towards simply expressing your own feelings and needs. The sources offer a kind of template.
Oh, useful.
Yeah. What I see here, you state the specific observable behavior. I feel, you name your emotion, because my need for, you state the unmet need, is not being met. Would you be willing to, you state your clear, positive request?
Okay, that structure is really clear. Takes the heat out of it, focuses on your experience.
Exactly. And critically, the sources emphasize taking responsibility for what you want. Just state your preference, your desire, your limit, or your deal breaker clearly, without needing approval, without adding those weak qualifiers like, you'll probably think this is crazy, but...
Or asking, does that make sense? After you state a boundary.
Right. Don't apologize for having a need or a limit.
Makes sense. And being specific is also key, they say.
Absolutely non-negotiable. Instead of a vague complaint like, oh, we never go out anymore, state clearly what you want. I'd really like to make Tuesday nights our regular date night.
Much harder to misunderstand or wiggle out of. Okay, what about that auto-advice tendency we talked about? What's the antidote they suggest?
The antidote is learning to ask expansive questions. When someone comes to you with a problem, your gut reaction might be to jump in and fix it.
Totally.
Instead, the advice is to pause, take a breath, and ask questions that empower them to find their own answers. Things like, what does your gut instinct say about this? Or, how do you really feel about the situation?
So you're guiding them back to themselves.
Exactly. And the sources highlight the power of silence after you ask. Resist that urge to fill the space. Just wait for their response. It supports their sovereignty, their ability to solve their own problems.
That feels like a massive shift, actually, from taking on their burden to just holding space.
It truly is. And the workbooks, they provide specific scripts and templates for common tricky situations, which can be incredibly helpful when you're first starting out and the words don't come easily.
Oh, like actual phrases?
Yeah. For example, simple ways to say no clearly and kindly without over-explaining, like just, thanks for thinking of me, but I can't make it. Hope you have an amazing time.
Okay, simple. Or saying no while maybe offering limited help.
Exactly. Like, I'd love to help you with that project, and I'm available between 2 and 4 tomorrow afternoon. Sets a clear limit.
Got it. They also offer lines for handling those awkward, inappropriate personal questions.
Yes. Maybe turning it back gently with a simple, why do you ask? Or sometimes more directly exposing the boundary violation like, why? Are you looking for a mom? Depending on the context, of course.
Oh, okay. How about responding to passive aggression? Or teasing that just crosses a line and isn't funny?
A clear, direct response is often best. Actually, that wasn't funny to me and I don't like it. Or if someone is dismissing or negating your feelings.
Like saying, you shouldn't feel that way.
Right. A response could be, I'm telling you how I feel right now. I'm not actually asking for your opinion on whether I should feel this way.
Ooh, those are strong, but very clear. And for dealing with blame or those guilt trips people sometimes lay on you?
The sources provide some great scripts for that too. Things like, your decisions are ultimately your business, and if you choose to react out of guilt or a bad conscience, that's also your business to manage.
Taking the responsibility back to them.
Exactly. Or to someone who's clearly trying to control you with guilt. Please stop trying to control me with guilt. Just naming it.
Wow. How about addressing really difficult behavior like someone actually yelling at you?
Yeah, there's a template for that too. Something along the lines of, look, I understand you were under a lot of pressure, but that is not an excuse for screaming at me. I am not willing to be an emotional punching bag for you. Please do not let it happen again. Very firm.
That's a clear consequence. The sources even include scripts for just ending conversations that are going nowhere productive.
Yep. Something simple like, this conversation isn't really going anywhere helpful and it's making me uncomfortable. I'm going to hang up now. I need to leave now.
So many practical examples in the sources to draw from, sounds like. And they even cover how to bring up something difficult from the past.
Yes, because it's never really too late to address an old hurt or a pattern that's still bothering you. You can open it gently, maybe with something like, I've been thinking about an interaction we had last year, and something about it has been kind of sitting with me.
Okay, opens the door. And what about framing boundary requests using mutual benefit language? What's that?
That's a really smart tactic, especially when you need to restate a boundary that's been crossed before. For example, with a partner who is often late for dinner, instead of just complaining again.
Which probably doesn't work anyway.
Right. You might try saying, hey, if you could just text me when you know you're going to be late, I can keep the food warm for you. That's the benefit for them. And then we can avoid getting into that same argument when you get home. That's the benefit for you and implicitly for them too. It shows how the boundary actually helps the relationship function better for both of you.
Okay, putting all this into practice. It sounds like it will almost definitely bring pushback from some people in your life.
Oh, the sources are absolutely clear on that. Expect it. When you change the steps to the dance, people who were comfortable with the old dance will resist.
Yeah.
But their resistance, their reaction, that's their side of the street, as Cole puts it. Your job is to hold your boundary kindly and firmly, not get derailed or manipulated by their reaction.
You have to stay the course, even when it feels really uncomfortable or they get upset.
Yes, exactly. And have faith that gradual change is possible. Don't let the fear of their potential response silence you or make you revert back to the old ways.
What about those really, really challenging relationships, ones you can't just easily walk away from, maybe with certain family members or co-parents, or where there might be narcissistic tendencies or even abuse involved? That's incredibly tough.
It is. And the sources do address this very difficult reality. For navigating relationships with people described as boundary destroyers, particularly when you can't easily end the contact, like if children are involved, they suggest shifting your approach more towards a business transaction model.
Business transaction, meaning
Communicating very unemotionally, stating facts, needs, or limits clearly and concisely without getting drawn into their emotional drama or justifications.
acknowledging their behavior perhaps, but without getting pulled into the vortex.
Exactly. The idea is to understand that their difficult behavior often stems from their own deep insecurity or wounds. Having that compassion perhaps helps you, but without letting that understanding excuse the behavior or make you feel responsible for fixing them.
Okay.
And here's where a strategic piece comes in, which might feel counterintuitive. When possible, sometimes you need to appeal to their desire to be seen or appreciated or feel powerful, essentially strategically seeding their ego just enough in a way that helps your needs get met and avoids a direct, unproductive power struggle.
That sounds like a tough needle to thread, but I can see how it might be effective or necessary when completely disengaging isn't an option, like the example they gave of getting a difficult partner to help with homework by praising how well they explain complex concepts.
Precisely that kind of thing. It's about finding pragmatic ways to navigate the interaction, to protect your own energy, and achieve your necessary outcomes in situations where direct, assertive boundary setting might just lead to escalating conflict or even further harm. It's tactical.
So, becoming a boundary boss clearly isn't about some instant transformation. It's definitely a journey, requires consistent practice, a lot of self-reflection.
Absolutely. It's not a finish line you cross. It's really an ongoing process of learning and adjusting.
Reflecting on those insta-yes moments you have, or the over-functioning patterns, how you express emotions, or if you express them.
And really understanding your inherent boundary rights. The sources lay out what they call a boundary boss bill of rights.
A bill of rights, like what?
Yeah, fundamental rights, like the right to say no without feeling guilty, the right to have your own feelings and preferences even if others don't understand them, the right not to justify or over-explain yourself constantly. Internalizing these rights is presented as crucial foundational work.
The workbooks sound like they probably offer guided exercises for that kind of reflection.
Yes, definitely. Journaling prompts, specific exercises to help you explore your personal patterns, your history, your internal landscape. And finally, the sources really stress that while communication scripts are helpful tools.
Right, the words matter.
The words matter, but becoming a boundary boss is ultimately about embodying the change. It's showing up with different behavior, different body language, carrying yourself with a different kind of energy. You're essentially retraining yourself, and in doing so, you are retraining the people around you how to treat you.
Well, this deep dive into Terri Cole's work, it really makes it clear that building healthy boundaries is, well, it's a journey of self-discovery, definitely requires practicing self-compassion. And ultimately, it seems like an act of radical self-love.
It really is framed that way. It's presented as a skill that, even if it feels completely unnatural, maybe even terrifying at first, is absolutely learnable with intention and practice.
And I think the most empowering takeaway from these sources, for me anyway, is that simple reminder.
Yeah.
Your feelings matter. What you want matters. You are completely allowed to prioritize your own well-being.
It's such a profound shift away from those old, often deeply ingrained patterns of people-pleasing or feeling trapped by others' expectations.
So as you, our listener, move forward from this deep dive, here's maybe a thought to sit with. How might consciously claiming just one single item from that Boundary Boss Bill of Rights today, maybe it's the right to say no without guilt, or the right not to justify yourself. How might claiming just that one right begin to shift the dynamic, even slightly, in one key relationship in your life?